Hey guys, you're listening to the Forestry Project Podcast with me, your host, Jace McCauley. We are the source for how to better manage your land and achieve forest legacy reimagined. So let's get into the show, and I hope y'all enjoy it. Alright, so with that, welcome to episode 4 of the Forestry Project Podcast. In today's episode, I kind of want to discuss forest management plans and give you a little bit of background of what is involved in a management plan, and then how might you be able to use it on your land, the benefits, and why you would want a forest management plan for your land. So to talk about forest management plans is Dr. Adam Maggard. He is an associate professor and extension specialist in the College of Forestry, Wildlife, and Environment at Auburn University. He holds multiple degrees in natural resource ecology and management, business management, and forest resources and conservation. I had Dr. Maggard in my forest management class in undergrad, and he was also the professor over the Fuel Leadership Academy, which, if you remember in episode 1 of the podcast, I go through how that class was kind of the catalyst for the Forestry Project and what I've got going on now. Dr. Maggard teaches several courses in forest management, business management for forest products and leadership. He specializes in financial aspects of forest management and planning, optimizing the use of forest resources, and multiple use management. He's also involved in research benefiting forest landowners and professionals, as well as he's my major professor in my research, where we're identifying ways to increase family forest landowners' use of professional forest management with consulting foresters. With that, it is my honor to welcome the next guest onto the show. Dr. Maggard, thanks for being on. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Jason. I really appreciate you asking me to participate in the podcast. I commend you on your, going out and making this happen. I think it's a great thing, and it's something that it will be very beneficial to the listeners. I think it's something that we need. We know we always need to find ways to reach out to folks and help with education, help with answering topics they may need help or assistance with, and just a general discussion of some of these topics. I saw what you have done so far, and it's just, even with my background and what I do, I still got kind of captured with those, listening through those, and kind of just going along with them. So I commend you on what you're doing. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And like I said, thank you for the Fuel Leadership Academy and, having that project. That was one of the big catalysts for doing this. So I'm very appreciative.
Yeah.
So today's topic, like I was saying, is forest management plans and how forest management plans can benefit family forest landowners, or even just landowners in general, if you're considering, getting a piece of property or whatnot and start managing it. So what are some of before we get into a true management plan, one of the key things is understanding why landowners own land. So from your research and from others, what are some of the things that you've seen as like overarching reasons for land ownership?
Yeah, and it's such a simple question. It sounds so simple, but when you really look into why folks own forest land, it really gets complex, and there's a lot of factors that get into that. And kind of an example I'll give is, if you think about the Midwest, and you think about row crops, corn, soybeans, those type of things, you have a lot of landowners. Similar situation, right? They range in how many acres they own. A lot of them own very few acres, but they still, that's what they do. That's what they rely on for their livelihood. But the difference between that kind of system or cohort of landowners versus what we have in terms of, what we see with forest landowners in the Southeast is really the fact that their objectives, right? Yeah. So the landowners here, they have so many objectives. Then they vary, right? If you had 10 landowners in this room, I would be willing to bet that you're going to have some shape or form of a different approach or different viewpoints of objectives from all 10. Some of them may overlap, obviously.
Exactly.
But it's not like, if you think back to the corn and soybean folks, or any agriculture crop, that's kind of an annual crop, that their objectives to grow that crop, harvest that crop, and produce that good. With forest landowners, that may be one aspect of what they do, but there's so many different things and so many different objectives that forest landowners have, and varying sizes of acres they own, that question about ownership gets very complex very quick. And we can talk about that and talk about some of the research I've done. So, speaking on that side of things, to kind of add to that, it really, I guess the cop out answer is it depends. But essentially, what we found is, looking into this, something I look at a lot, being an extension specialist. I deal with landowners all the time. I work with them. I talk to them. I help them understand their objectives, and provide them education, to help understand different aspects of forest management and so forth. So, studying all this and getting to know these landowners, we've been able to kind of break that down a little more and really truly understand what it means. And if you took a blanket survey, and one of the well-known surveys, the National Woodlands Owner Survey, does a fantastic job of continuing to collect that data and understand what's kind of driving ownership with these landowners. But that's kind of an overarching picture, right?
Yeah.
And based on the diversity of land size holdings or acreage owned with these landowners, we've learned that it really depends, right? So
It does.
if you look at Alabama alone, we found that basically, if you were to somewhat try to attempt to break this down into simpler terms, those landowners that own 10 acres or less, versus those landowners that own between 10 and 500 acres, versus those landowners that own 500, plus acres.
Yeah.
Those three categories, you can really start to make sense or find trends in what we see in ownership. And usually that 500 acre plus category, they're the ones that are going to more consistently be on the income production, timber production side of things, with economic driven goals. That 10 to 500, which happens to be the majority of, if you looked at ownerships and not acreage,
Yeah.
the majority of ownerships fall in that category, not just in Alabama, but across the region, right, in the Southeast.
Exactly.
But that's
Yeah.
where the mixed bag is, right? I mean, that's where you have reasons for owning land are, all over the place. So we've spent some time to really try and understand that more, and try and see if we can connect any of the dots. And at least in Alabama, what we found with that group that's kind of between 10 and 500 acres is, it often depends on how many acres they own. If they're towards that higher end, they're going to be influenced more towards timber production, towards economic driven goals and objectives for that ownership. When they're on the lower end of that, there's going to be varying reasons. I think legacy and being able to pass that land down, I think that kind of blankets across the board. I think everybody somewhat, to a certain extent, kind of deems that as an important reason when you're talking about these family forest landowners in this category. But going from an economic or financially driven, goal and objective of owning that land to having something that's more on the fronts of recreation, aesthetic value, just enjoying it as part of your family or part of where you live, that's really that kind of swings back and forth based on how what size acreage that you're dealing with and size the property is and the holdings.
Yeah.
Another thing is where they're located, right, within the state.
Yep.
So we've noticed that, and we found through research that regardless of, to a certain extent, regardless of how many acres landowners own, if they're, more located more towards markets, right? For timber production, they're going to have an influence there that kind of drives, them to pursue that, right?
Yeah.
Versus areas that don't have established timber markets or don't have many options for timber, they're not going to be, driven by that as much. It's going to be more recreation. It's going to be more alternative income sources outside of timber production that they may be wanting to focus on. It may be just to benefit the health and aesthetic value of the property, so they can just enjoy it for other reasons. And that's really the two factors, right? So the size of the acreage that they hold, their landowner or land holding size, and where they're located in the state are two big factors that we're seeing have an influence on the reason for owning that land, keeping that land. Right?
Yeah.
And just with that, like I said, there's a mixed bag in that 10 to 500 acre group. There's a lot of multiple use reasons. There's a lot of reasons they own this land, but there's multiple reasons, right? It's not just one primary reason. Legacy, beauty and scenery or aesthetics, hunting and fishing, recreational value. Those are all near the top of that list with that group. But we see a lot more multiple reasons for that rather than what we typically see with the 10 acres or less or the 500 acres or more.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that multiple reasons for owning is a very important thing to bring up, strictly because, a management plan does not have to just have one objective that you're trying to meet. It can really go toward multiple objectives with those multiple goals. And especially, I'm glad that you mentioned location of where your land is, because that is a very important thing to consider, especially when you're looking at what markets are around you. I know in Northwest Alabama, where our land is, markets are kind of limited. We have a couple of sawmills, but, if you're trying to get into some of the newer markets, there's really nothing there because they can't ship it anywhere. So when we're, looking at management plans, we do have to consider where we are, how many acres we have, whether it's even economical to go through it, to get loggers out to, harvest trees if you're wanting timber harvest revenue. So with that and kind of getting into the multiple use, are there any overarching reasons or like goals that a landowner would typically have getting into a plan?
Yeah, so it kind of carries over to your management plan, right? And the more multiple reasons you have, at least initially, for having that property, the more complex your management plan can be.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you go from just, hey, we've got this as a financial investment, and our goal here is to make a return on our investment and focus on timber production, that can get complicated. But essentially, you have one goal you're focusing on, right?
Yeah.
But if you have multiple reasons and you kind of want to dabble in a little of everything, that can make a management plan complicated. It can make it a little complex, regardless of how many acres you have.
Yeah.
And it can get tedious pretty quick in terms of just trying to, untie all the different pieces, right?
Exactly.
That.
Yeah.
So, I think it all starts with, when landowners kind of approach a management plan, they may have a set one objective, and typically if you broke those out and took away the multiple use category, timber production, like I said, it's usually going to be around, and this doesn't mean that we're talking full on timber production, but it's going to be it'll be there as an objective. They want to make some money from their property. They want to manage their timber sustainably and harvest. Not it doesn't have to be a full on industry operation, but that's typically we see as one of the goals. But it really goes back to how many acres they have, right? If we have the landowners that have the smaller acreages, timber production is probably not going to be near the top of that list. those top three objectives are going to be more driven towards, recreational value, aesthetic value. I think we've learned that all landowners understand, or at least, a good amount of our landowners, I shouldn't say all, a good amount of the landowners in the state and the region for that matter, I think they understand the importance of management and the importance of healthy forest, but it's taking that next step, implementing a practice, what are the factors that are preventing them from doing so, if they're aware that management is a good thing. I think it really varies, based on what their capacity is going into this, and what they ultimately want to get from it, right?
Yeah.
The larger the track, you're going to see more of those, financially driven goals. The smaller the track, you're typically going to see more, personal values that rise to the front in terms of objectives, whether that's just, I just, want to maintain this property for, to make, to have it for better health and to maintain the health of the property and the aesthetic value so I can pass it on to my children or, whoever it is down the road. Recreational values, whether that's hunting, on the property or for other recreational opportunities there, and just kind of enjoying it, right? Rather than it being anything to do with kind of a financially driven objective. And like I said, I hesitate to put a blanket ownership objective, that kind of covers all landowners.
Yeah.
I think if you're going to break it down, you should at least look at those two things, where they're located and how many acres they own. And then you can start to kind of put those, top three reasons or blanket reasons for ownership that's the most common with those landowners. So in terms of that, in terms of kind of management objectives, those two things go hand in hand. I think just the objectives of owning the land versus what their objectives are for reasons for kind of going or pursuing a management plan and making it active on their property.
Yeah, those are very closely tied together. So especially, so you have a smaller landowner and they've got a lot of different reasons for owning the land, but they're wanting to get a management plan, and it's really best to just have like one main goal you're trying to reach instead of having, like three or four different goals that kind of split up your time, especially if this is not their full-time career. You may only get to spend a few weekends out there doing stuff. What would be your advice for going out and actually deciding on a main plan?
Yeah, so I mean, I always revert back, and I say this, not just with your overarching forest management plan, but I think I give the same advice when you're looking at trying to start something. Maybe it's alternative income, right? But this kind of goes hand in hand in my view of just how to break this down and how to think through this process. And the one thing I think they first need to think about is and understand is, landowners, these aren't, most of the time, these different objectives they have aren't just kind of, yeah, that's what I want to do, let's initiate it and walk away from it.
Yeah.
These are things that are going to need time, going to need effort, going to need consistent, attention and planning to be successful at. And I think that's one thing to think about. So I think the two things that I kind of drive landowners to think through the most is, one, the suitability, and what I mean for that is it, your goals and objectives suitable for the property you have? Are your goals and objectives sustainable, not only based on the resources you have in the property, but for you, right?
Yeah.
Is it something that's going to fit your lifestyle? Is it something that is sustainable from whether it's a cost capacity standpoint, financial capacity? Is it just resource availability? Is it time commitment? Those two things. So suitability and sustainability are things I really push landowners to think about when they kind of get started. Right?
Yeah.
So, I guess the biggest thing, one thing you can tie back to all this, and you've probably heard me say this before, is, and this is just a statement. It's not always directly about, producing something, but in really anything they do, from a landowner standpoint is, kind of to cover that is, there's not always a reason, you don't have to produce something all the time, right, to meet your goals. So what I mean by that is if you don't have a market there, then what's the good in focusing your objectives on timber, right?
Exactly.
If you have markets there and you're not focusing on timber, it's kind of the flip, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of dynamics. They got to think about the ecological side of things. They got to think about the social aspects. They also got to think about the economic aspects of it. But kind of an umbrella of all of that needs to be kind of what the suitability is for their property. What species they have, what's their property good at producing naturally. Uh, what the capabilities are, what their capacity is there, and then the sustainability, not just from a resource standpoint, but a personal standpoint.
Yeah. And it is very important to consider that personal standpoint. And also, when you're going through that, be very realistic of your abilities and the time that you're going to spend. Because I know, at least with me, like, if I could spend every day out on the property, I most certainly would.
Right.
And I would love to, like, plan all of these wonderful activities and get the land, back just perfect. But in all reality, I don't have all the time to spend out there. And that's really where, like, picking, the most important things to get done. And that's where I would kind of advocate for get out on your land and see what's the most important to you. What do you notice when you first go out there? And that will kind of help a little bit with deciding those goals.
Yeah, and kind of the first step is really, and I don't think this can be overstated, is it's really know your woods, right?
Yes.
Understand what you have, understand what resources you have there, what they are, what they should be based on your forest type, what the history of it was, what's been done there in the past. Take some time to really take all that in and really get an understanding of that, because that's something you can build off of as a landowner going forward. And like I said, management plans can get complicated. They can get complicated really quick, but they don't have to be, right?
Yeah.
Our goal is not to create a 1,000-page management plan for everybody, right?
No.
Our goal is to the management plan. The goal of the management plan is really essentially there to provide guidance and understanding of when things are going to occur, when you should do things, timelines, and really taking in those different factors that can help you reach those goals. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be, and it can get there very quickly, but that's where it comes into really, I think you just got to step back. You got to understand what you have, know what you're dealing with, know your woods, understand your resources, and be true to yourself in terms of what's suitable and what's sustainable. And I've said that multiple times, but that sustainability is kind of two-factor, right? It's two-pronged. Yeah. It's what you got to think about what's suitable and sustainable for yourself, but what's suitable and sustainable for your property as well.
Yeah. And just a side note, getting out on your property, there's, I'm a big proponent. There's no bad day in the woods. Any day I get to spend in the woods is great. And if you're wanting to learn how to get in the woods, look at what you have on your land, look at the historical land use, be able to read, aerial images, maps, and everything else. We have a great playlist on the YouTube channel that is like management basics. And you can also find the blog post on the website under the Forest Management Basics tab as well. But, like Dr. Maggard said, get out on your land and actually learn what is out there, because that's going to tell you a lot of what might you want out there, what you need to control, especially as far as invasives go. If you can't control the invasives and get what you want on your property, it doesn't matter, the envisioned idea you have for it. It's going to be very tough to get there, which is kind of one of the things we're dealing with. We've got a lot of Chinese privet, and
Yeah,
it's
and
just
I think that's one way to approach it, right? That's
yeah,
kind of gets back to that. I keep saying sustainability, but you think about it from that standpoint. Your main goal going forward should be able to implement something that first and foremost is going to keep that forest, happy, healthy,
yeah,
sustainable in the future. You don't want to implement something or a goal and objectives that's going to not be able to keep up with that, right?
yeah,
Not be able to sustain that. So I think, and we found that through research. A lot of the landowners, they understand and what their concerns are things that deal with insects, disease, invasive species. They understand those threats. So, that's usually something that they try to target in management plans and the ones we've worked with, above all else. But that's just part of the puzzle, right? That
yeah,
management plan is designed. Okay, here's your objectives, right?
yep,
It may be multiple things you're trying to do. In that case, you're going to have to think about how those interact and how those, what you implement in terms of forest management practices affect each of those differently. If it's just one thing, you still are going to need to think about, those factors, right? Invasive species. How, what am I going to do to make my forest more resilient to insects and diseases to make this sustainable? So I think
exactly,
those are all overarching factors that
yeah,
go into management plans that are another benefit to that. Okay. And I guess the main thing I would say is I'm a very big component of consulting foresters.
yes,
I think consulting foresters are one of the best things a landowner can do initially is establish a connection with a consulting forester in their
yeah,
area. They can bring so much benefit and advice, to that situation. This isn't something that you need to do on your own,
yeah,
right? This is something that there's help out there, there's assistance out there, and I think that's one of the things that is just leaps and bounds beneficial for landowners to get involved with that, and find that connection and work with those consulting foresters. We know that those that have actually received advice for managing their forest versus actually have a written management plan in place is different. There's more that have received advice, but there's very few landowners that we're finding that actually have written management plans, right?
yeah, yep,
And you can get back to the whole acreage owned dynamic and all that with it, but the bottom line is a lot of those landowners, they're being prevented from doing something, taking that next step, even though they know what they want, because they have that fear of wrongdoing, right?
yeah,
Or it may be a cost constraint, or it may be, just not having the time capacity or the availability that they think it needs to be there. Well,
exactly, yeah,
these are all things consulting foresters, you know, they're essentially there to take all that burden off of you,
yeah,
right? You know,
yep,
and when it comes to revenue generation, it comes to cost of practices, they're going to be able to tell you what those are up front. They're going to be able to assist you with, generating revenue off your property to account for some of that cost, right? And
yeah,
help you with that. So it's definitely worth, probably the number one advice is get established, know your neighbors, know your landowners that are around you, understand what's going on there, get to know that community of forest landowners.
yep,
There's different programs that a lot across our state, in different counties and different regions that landowners can become a part of, that they can get further education or advice, but reach out and get connected with a consulting forester.
yeah,
You know,
yeah. That is very important, which I guess goes without saying, seeing how my entire master's is figuring out how landowners, how we can kind of improve that. But it is very important to talk to someone because you're not just getting someone, with a 4-year degree. You're also getting someone that has who knows how much experience doing exactly that. What I've kind of always said is if you had to have surgery, would you rather do it on yourself or would you rather pay someone who's been doing that for 20 years and knows what they're doing?
yeah, I mean that's kind of why we go to the doctor, right?
Yeah.
And that's it can be viewed that way. It's often not,
No.
but it that's the bottom line is these aren't, that forest that's just sitting over there, if you have, even if the forest across the street, right? Just sitting there is long term, right? It needs attention.
Yeah.
Right? Where, things have to happen. You have to take trees out. You have to, make sure it's going to be sustainable into the future. And that's something that, a consulting forester is going to know all about. And if it's your objectives are timber management, they're going to be the ones that are connected to the local markets. They're going to be the ones that can understand your inventory, provide you with that resource, take the burden of, the negotiation or discussion with timber buyers and, selling that timber and that whole aspect, that whole dynamic off your plate. And, the history and research has shown that, consulting foresters bring, more money to the plate for landowners.
Yeah.
From that regard. And if it's not a timber objective or selling any resources for that matter, still connect with a consulting forester because they're going to be able to help you with a management plan or advice on, just managing your forest sustainably, creating a management plan that fits your objectives and goals.
Yeah.
They're not just there to buy and sell your timber.
Yeah.
Right.
So, we've discussed, kind of the goals that landowners might want to consider. Getting into management plans specifically, and I know we've touched on this quite a bit. How do management plans help landowners achieve the goals or objectives that they have for their land?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's like I say, it's a roadmap, right? It's going to provide guidance. It's you're going to have a lot of different things that are going on when you have a management plan. When do you know when you should thin, right?
Yeah.
When do you know when it's time to do a prescribed burn? When do you need to think about competition control? All those factors that interact, right? When you implement different activities on your property, when and how you should do it, right?
Yeah.
That's what a management plan is going to help lay that out for you, right?
Yeah.
It's going to provide you a timeline of those activities. You're going to be able to see as a landowner when different cost and revenue, cash flows are going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you should expect those to happen long term. But essentially, it's going to be that guidance, that roadmap of where you are now,
Yeah.
to where you're going to get to achieve your goals and objectives along the way. And like I said, I talked about it earlier, the co-op situation out in the Midwest where you have a bunch of landowners that can come together, they can reduce costs, they can, benefit overall by working as a larger unit.
Yeah.
That's not been that successful at all here in the Southeast because of these varying objectives, right?
Yep.
And that's the importance of a management plan, right? In our systems is that each individual landowner is going to have different goals and objectives, different end, games in sight that they want to try and reach. And it's like I said, there's a lot of different aspects that go into that. So these management plans are going to be designed to let them know what they have,
Yeah.
what it's going to take to get where they are now to where they want to be.
Yep.
And then when all those activities, when the, predicting future, the future of their forest, whether that's, growth and yield models and timber, or if that's, habitat development in addition to their property, and when all those things are going to start to happen based on different practices that you're implementing on the property activities, and ultimately optimizing, it's finding ways to optimize your limited resources, right?
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of landowners are operating on limited resources. It doesn't matter how much money they have or how much land they have. They have limiting resources, whether that's time, whether that's assistance, whether that's,
Exactly.
finances. There's going to be limited resources involved, and a management plan is going to help optimize that. So, an example is timeline. A landowner that's concerned about costs and revenues, a timeline that's part of that management plan and kind of lays all that out and explains that is going to show them when they can expect revenues coming in, when there's going to be years where they may have costs without revenue generation.
Yeah.
So it's a way to plan ahead. It's a way to follow. It's a map essentially of getting from A to B, and it's you don't have to have a management plan. We obviously know that a lot of landowners don't, but it's so beneficial that
Yeah.
landowners really need to take that next step and get that map in front of them, with a professional and realize, how much more successful and efficient they're going to be at reaching those goals and objectives. If you don't have that plan ahead and how one thing affects another that you're implementing, and you're kind of just doing management based on reaction to things,
Yeah.
that's not going to help you get to your end goal, right?
No.
So if you just say, oh, it's time to burn or it's time to thin without a plan going forward,
Yeah.
that may be beneficial right away, but how is that going to impact long term your ultimate goals and objectives? Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, just understanding, the ecology of the sites that you're working with, especially like what time of the year to burn, depending on, what you're trying to do. You may need to do it different times of the year, different times of the day, knowing your markets, knowing even if you have a good market, having someone in your corner that knows who to talk to get the best price for your timber and all of that, it doesn't take long for a management plan to pay for itself.
Oh, it's absolutely, yeah, and that's kind of expanding on that suitability for your property, right?
Yeah.
It's not just what your resources are, what your property is capable of doing, but understanding, what are your local markets, what are their needs, right? You want to be producing. If you're doing a timber management plan, you want to produce the type of product that your local markets are needing. There's no sense in producing, a product or timber size class that you don't have a market for.
Yeah.
Right. So you need to understand your local environment, your local market conditions, what the demand is on that, the wood flow situation, buyers for that. And that's where consulting foresters are very beneficial
Yeah.
to landowners and understanding that dynamic.
With that, is there any like closing thoughts or maybe a call to action that you would give landowners if they're interested in learning more about a management plan, maybe trying to get one for their property?
Yeah, like I said, my biggest advice is, when it comes to forest management, uh, you know, goals and objectives, it doesn't matter what they are, they're going to be varying goals and objectives, but consider, you can kind of break it down to three different aspects, right?
Yeah.
They need to consider the ecological side of things. And what I mean by that is their soil types, their soil conditions, their water resources, endangered species or wildlife impacts to all of that. What is the situation on their property and how are those going to be impacted by what they're trying to accomplish, right?
Yeah.
The other side's the social side of it, right?
Yep.
You can find yourself with challenges of prescribed burning now, right? We have
Very
smaller,
much so.
tracks are being, fragmented, right? You're starting to see smaller and smaller tracks, and that, because they're smaller, doesn't mean management's less important,
No.
right? It's just, it may be difficult to get some of that done, and we're seeing that. That's a whole nother story we can have a whole nother discussion on.
Yeah.
But, understanding your adjoining landowners, understanding what's going on there, understanding, laws and regulations, understanding, aesthetics and different ownership types and what's going on in your area is really going to bring a lot. The availability of loggers and foresters in your area, those type of things are going to bring a lot to understanding the best path too. But and then the economic side, what's the cost of management? What are your limitations there? The current value of the trees, the market conditions in your area. Those are all different things. And the same with alternative income, right?
Yeah.
You may be in an area where something other than timber is very beneficial or may be very attractive to the landowner in terms of generating revenue. My biggest thing is, and my call to action is, landowners with goals and objectives, with that interest, really get involved, right?
Yeah.
Get involved with, local forest planning committees, extension,
Yep.
programming and meetings, different associations across the state. You're going to learn a lot of information there, meet a lot of contacts
Yeah.
and connections that can, assist you and really understand your property. Start to learn things that can not make you a forester,
Yeah.
but understand how to communicate
Yep.
what you're really wanting to professional forester or to consultant foresters that can kind of help that dynamic and help that process. So, we have a lot of resources. There's things that landowners can do, and, understanding measurements, understanding different, property lines and different aspects of their property
Yeah.
that they can benefit from, that if nothing else, it's going to help them communicate with consulting foresters, help them understand each other, understand where they're coming from, their objectives, and being able to do that. So that it kind of eliminates that, or not really eliminates, but reduces that fear of wrongdoing or not knowing how to do it or how to accomplish something. It's just communicate, right? Communicate with your different resources that you have available. And I'm not saying go out and hire a consulting forester. Like I said, that's very beneficial. But if nothing else, go and educate yourself, learn different things about your property, learn how things are acting. The last podcast I listened to of yours was, with ecology, and
Yeah.
that's a big part of it, right?
It is.
Understanding the ecology of your property, the species that you have there. There's so much things landowners can do from that aspect. I think that can help them make that connection and take that next step. So my advice is to get involved. Don't be afraid to ask for assistance. Don't be afraid to go out and learn something new.
Yep.
And really get a feel for your suitability, your sustainability, both personally and with your property. Understand that property, know your woods, and then get assistance with making this happen, taking that next step, because there's plenty of opportunities out there.
Yeah. And what I always say is, don't try to reinvent the wheel.
That's right.
Someone else has already tried to do what you're trying to do. I promise you, nothing we do now is truly new.
Right.
So getting out, talking to those groups, you learn what works for others. You also learn what not to do. So all those can be very important things to consider. With that, Dr. Maggard, thank you very much for your time sitting down. It was a pleasure, the conversation. And hopefully we'll be able to schedule another one soon.
Yeah, I'd love to be back. There's plenty of things we can talk about. And like I said, thanks for having me, and I commend you on what you're doing. I think it's fantastic, Jace.
Thank you very much. With that, guys, if you haven't yet, subscribe on your preferred platform. And if you like the content that the Forestry Project's putting out, go follow us on social media, on YouTube. Go check out the website. We've got a e-newsletter coming out soon, and that will be every month, kind of showcasing the latest content. Thank you all so much for listening and all the support that you've shown the Forestry Project so far, and I am very excited for where we're going. So with that, happy management and God bless.